For nearly 5 decades, Graceland stood frozen in time, honoring Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll.
There is a door at Graceland that almost no visitor has ever seen. It sits behind a velvet rope, past the staircase every tour guide points to and quickly walks away from, at the very top of the mansion. For 48 years, that door stayed shut. Not locked in the dramatic, cinematic sense. Just closed, ignored, and folded into a silence so total that even people who worked at Graceland for decades couldn't tell you what was behind it. Then, in the winter of 2025, that changed. A small team was finally let inside. What they found wasn't a monster or a hidden resident, despite what the rumors would later claim, but it was something almost stranger. It was a version of Elvis Presley that the public had never been allowed to meet. Uncertain, searching, tender, and quietly aware that his time was running out. This is the story of that room, the man who filled it, and the decades of secrecy that kept the door closed. There's a reason this story keeps pulling people back in, even decades after the headlines first broke. It isn't really about an attic, or even about Elvis Presley specifically. It's about the universal, uncomfortable gap between the image a famous person presents and the person actually living behind it. And what happens when that gap is finally allowed to close, even a little, even 50 years too late. In March of 1957, a 22-year-old Elvis Presley signed the papers on a limestone-faced colonial house on the southern edge of Memphis. The asking price was a little under $14,000, an enormous sum for a young man who had grown up in public housing, but pocket change for someone whose career had just gone supernova. He kept the name the previous owners had given the estate. He liked how it sounded, Graceland. What followed over the next 2 decades was less a home renovation than the construction of a personality. Every room at Graceland tells you something different about the man who filled it. The living room, with its towering stained-glass peacocks, speaks to a performer who wanted grandeur even in the spaces where he simply sat and talked with friends. The jungle room, with its carved wooden furniture and green shag carpet climbing up the walls, speaks to a man who never fully let go of playfulness, who wanted his house to feel a little bit like an adventure. The meditation garden, tucked behind white columns and a quiet fountain, speaks to someone else entirely, a person searching for stillness in a life that almost never offered any. Graceland's grounds held horses, dogs, and for a time, a mischievous chimpanzee that Elvis had dressed up and paraded through parties, an animal that staff later said mirrored Elvis's own restless, unpredictable energy better than anyone wanted to admit. But underneath the extravagance was a quieter architecture, and nowhere was that more true than in the space above the second floor, where Elvis was said to have kept a room that even his closest friends rarely entered. Even the mansion's public rooms hint at this duality if you look closely enough. The famous white-columned entrance, with its formal symmetry, was designed to project stability and old-money permanence. An image Elvis, a boy who grew up in a 2-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi, clearly wanted for himself. But walk 20 feet further into the jungle room, and that formality collapses entirely into something loud, tropical, and a little chaotic, as if the house itself couldn't decide whether it wanted to impress people or simply let its owner relax. Graceland, from the very beginning, was never one thing. It was built, room by room, as a kind of architectural autobiography, and the attic, it turns out, was simply the chapter nobody had been allowed to read yet. By the summer of 1977, the Elvis who returned home to Graceland after tours barely resembled the young man who had bought the house 20 years earlier. He was 42 years old, but visibly worn down. His weight had climbed, his stage shows had become inconsistent, and those closest to him had started to notice long stretches where he seemed distant, foggy, and exhausted in a way that sleep didn't fix. On the morning of August 16th, Elvis's fiancée at the time, Ginger Alden, woke up in the early afternoon to find that he wasn't in bed. This wasn't unusual on its own. Elvis had long kept an inverted schedule, sleeping through daylight hours and staying awake through the night. But as the afternoon stretched on and the house grew unusually quiet, she went looking for him. She found him in the bathroom, unresponsive. What happened over the next hour has been recounted many times. His road manager and close friend Joe Esposito rushing to attempt resuscitation, paramedics racing him to Baptist Memorial Hospital, and finally, just after 3 in the afternoon, doctors confirming what the entire staff already feared. Elvis Presley was gone. The official statement that evening, delivered by the county medical examiner, named cardiac arrhythmia as the cause. His heart had simply stopped. It was framed as a natural, if premature, death. But even in 1977, that explanation didn't sit comfortably with everyone who had watched Elvis's decline up close. The full toxicology results, released weeks after the initial statement, painted a far more complicated picture than natural causes. Multiple prescription medications were found in Elvis's system: sedatives, painkillers, and other pharmaceutical compounds, present in combinations that any modern physician would recognize as dangerous. His autopsy also noted an enlarged heart and other signs consistent with years of physical strain. At the center of the prescribing history was Dr. George Nikopoulos, known to friends and patients as Dr. Nick, who had served as Elvis's personal physician since the late 1960s. Investigations later revealed that in the final months of Elvis's life, Dr. Nick had written an extraordinary volume of prescriptions, enough that, spread across the year, they amounted to more than one new prescription every day and a half. Dr. Nick's defense, offered later to medical licensing boards, was that he was managing genuine chronic conditions: old injuries, digestive problems, and other ailments that caused Elvis real pain. He argued that controlled prescribing under his supervision was safer than leaving Elvis to seek medication elsewhere, uncontrolled and unsupervised. Tennessee prosecutors weren't convinced enough to secure a conviction in his 1980 criminal trial, where a jury ultimately found him not guilty. But medical regulators kept investigating, and in 1995, 18 years after Elvis's death, the state permanently revoked his license to practice medicine. More recent scholarship has complicated the story further. A 2020 biography by researcher Sally Hodel proposed that Elvis may have carried an undiagnosed genetic condition, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, which can damage the liver and lungs and cause exactly the kind of chronic symptoms Elvis struggled with for years. If accurate, it suggests that at least some of what looked like the consequences of excess might have actually been an undiagnosed illness compounding an already fragile situation. The truth, most researchers now agree, likely sits somewhere between the two explanations: a man managing real physical suffering, treated with medication that ultimately did him more harm than good. Friends who saw Elvis in those final weeks later described a man who seemed, in flashes, aware of his own decline. He talked more openly about mortality during casual conversations, sometimes half-joking about it, sometimes not joking at all. He spent long stretches reading rather than socializing, a habit that surprised people who remembered him as someone who needed constant company. Whatever was happening internally in the final months of his life, it wasn't invisible to the people closest to him, even if none of them fully grasped how little time was actually left. Elvis was laid to rest beside his mother, Gladys, at Forest Hill Cemetery in Memphis. Nearly 100,000 mourners lined the streets during the days that followed, and a funeral procession of 17 white Cadillacs carried friends, family, and public figures across the city. But the peace his family hoped for didn't last. Just 2 days after the funeral, cemetery security discovered that intruders had attempted to break into the mausoleum, apparently trying to disturb or remove the coffin. They were caught before they succeeded, but the damage to the site, and to the family's sense of safety, was already done. Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, made the decision that would ultimately shape the mystery at the center of this story. With local authorities assisting, he had Elvis's and Gladys's remains quietly relocated in the middle of the night to the meditation garden inside Graceland's own grounds, the same peaceful space Elvis had built years earlier as a private retreat. From that point forward, Graceland stopped being simply a home. It became something closer to a fortress: new alarm systems, round-the-clock security, and a hard line drawn around the upstairs floor and the attic above it, both placed permanently off-limits. When Graceland opened to the public in 1982, 5 years after Elvis's death, the tour route was carefully designed to showcase the mansion's most iconic rooms while steering visitors firmly away from the staircase. Tour guides gave the same explanation for decades: the upstairs floor was private, out of respect for the family, and it would remain that way indefinitely. For nearly half a century, that explanation held. Presidents, foreign dignitaries, and generations of devoted fans walked through the jungle room, admired the stained-glass peacocks, and stood at the grave in the meditation garden, but none of them were permitted upstairs. The attic, sitting above even the restricted second floor, became something closer to legend than architecture, a space fans speculated about but had absolutely no information on. That silence might have continued indefinitely if not for events that had nothing to do with the attic at all, and everything to do with a legal crisis that nearly cost the Presley family the entire estate. That silence held remarkably firm for a piece of American pop culture as heavily documented as Graceland. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, and entire academic conferences have been held examining Elvis's life and influence. Yet almost none of them could say with any authority what physically existed behind that upstairs door. It became one of the rare true blank spots left in modern celebrity history, a stretch of unrecorded, unphotographed, unexamined space sitting directly above one of the most visited private homes in the country. In the spring of 2024, an obscure company calling itself Nosany Investments and Private Lending LLC filed paperwork attempting to force the sale of Graceland at public auction. According to the filing, the estate had used Graceland as collateral on a multimillion-dollar loan and had defaulted, giving the lender the legal right to sell the property to the highest bidder. The claim sent shockwaves through the Presley family and their fan base. Riley Keough, Elvis's granddaughter and the person who had taken over management of the estate after her mother Lisa Marie Presley's death in early 2023, moved immediately to block the sale. Her legal team argued that the loan documents were fraudulent from top to bottom, that the signatures attributed to Lisa Marie had never actually been made by her, and that the entire lending arrangement appeared to be fabricated. With the auction date rapidly approaching, a Tennessee judge issued an emergency injunction halting the sale just one day before it was scheduled to occur, calling Graceland an irreplaceable piece of American cultural history. Tellingly, no representative from Nosany Investments ever appeared in court to defend the claim. Shortly afterward, federal authorities pursued the matter separately, and the scheme was publicly identified as an attempted fraud rather than a legitimate financial dispute. Graceland remained exactly where it had always been, in the hands of the Presley family. The scare, however, seemed to change something in how Riley Keough thought about the estate's future. Having nearly lost the mansion to strangers who had never set foot inside it, she began reconsidering what else the family had been holding back from the public for decades. Chief among those unresolved questions was the attic. In January of 2025, a small team of archivists, the kind typically hired to catalog museum collections rather than celebrity memorabilia, was brought to Graceland under a strict agreement of confidentiality. Their task was simple in description and enormous in weight. Document, for the first time in the estate's history, everything the attic contained. The stairwell leading up was narrow and dimly lit, and the air noticeably changed as they climbed, cooler, stiller, carrying the particular staleness of a room that has not exchanged air with the rest of a house in a very long time. A single working light fixture illuminated the door at the top. The lock, when it finally turned, was original, a brass mechanism that had not been touched since Vernon Presley sealed the space in the fall of 1977. What greeted the team on the other side wasn't chaos. It was order. Someone, almost certainly Elvis himself, in the last years of his life, had organized the attic with the same instinct for narrative that shaped every other room in the house. Wooden crates and cardboard boxes lined the walls, each labeled by hand in a looping, familiar script: Tupelo, Army, Hollywood Years, Comeback 68, Vegas. It read less like storage and more like an autobiography that had never been published. The organization itself surprised the team more than almost anything they found inside. Museum archivists are used to disorder. Estates are typically cataloged from chaos, boxes stacked without logic, items mixed across decades with no discernible system. This was different. Someone had taken real time to think about how this collection would eventually be read, sorting a life into distinct, legible chapters the way a writer might organize a memoir before ever putting a sentence on paper. It suggested, more than almost anything else recovered from the room, a level of self-awareness that the public version of Elvis rarely got credit for. The box marked Tupelo held items from Elvis's earliest childhood, including a small, threadbare teddy bear missing one eye, its fabric patched in several places with cloth that matched dresses his mother Gladys was known to have worn. Family records confirmed what the archivists suspected. This was a toy from Elvis's earliest years in Mississippi, sewn back together by his mother during a stretch of real financial hardship, after his father spent time in jail on a bad check conviction and the family had almost nothing. In the Army box, they discovered Gladys Presley's own Bible, given to Elvis before he shipped out for his military service in Germany in the late 1950s. Its spine was so worn it had been reinforced with tape, and its pages were dense with underlined verses and handwritten notes in the margins. Private thoughts that had nothing to do with performance, and everything to do with a young man trying to make sense of the world. One of the final marked passages, dated only days before his death, was Psalm 23. A leather-bound yearbook from his high school years surfaced as well, filled with signatures from classmates who, contrary to the later image of Elvis as an instant sensation, had known him first as a shy, occasionally teased teenager. One inscription simply read, "Keep singing. You're going places." The Hollywood box held costume pieces from his film years, alongside handwritten notes suggesting a man who felt increasingly boxed in by fame, along with a small collection of books on philosophy and spirituality, heavily annotated, clearly read more than once, that painted a picture of someone quietly wrestling with much bigger questions than the tabloids of his era ever gave him credit for. And in the box marked Vegas, archivists found a sealed 1974 medical report, its cover page noting cardiac concerns and recommending significant lifestyle changes, 3 full years before his death. The Presley family has kept the complete contents of that file private, releasing only enough to confirm its existence and general subject matter.